Now, for this afternoon, I was going to present simply the early part of a documentary by Tragedy and Hope dealing with mind manipulation. Catherine has been concerned about the methodologies utilized for getting people to think what the ruling elders and the ruling elites want us to think. And that's a very important subject because you are being manipulated from morning until night. How many of you have seen the movie American Sniper? The one. How many have seen the movie, not Terms of Endearment, Rules of Engagement? How many of you have seen Schindler's List? All of you have been subjecting yourself, knowingly or unknowingly, to propaganda. Schindler's List, or Saving Private Ryan, or Rules of Engagement, many items of entertainment, be they television, movies. I listen to National Public Radio because I enjoy the music, but with some frequency I turn it off because I choose not to submit myself to that kind of propaganda. I have shared with all of you some resources from the internet that are reasonably reliable sources of information rather than propaganda. The point that I am making is that you have been spoon-fed an understanding of what is reality since before you went into kindergarten. 16,000 hours of school are not necessary for you to learn how to read and write and do arithmetic. They are very necessary for you to learn how to be socialized and behave in your community. The very same school system has quite consciously abandoned any sense of morality that is based in concrete ethics. It is strictly relational and strictly cultural, with the intent of your absorbing your moral foundation, not from your parents, not from your community, but from the people who are dictating to you from above. That's not at all accidental. Why do you have to spend, or will your children spend all day in school, isolated and separated from their parents? Because it is absolutely important to supplant the parental influence with the school influence. From whence is derived the school influence? The Department of Education. I encourage you to read Charlotte Iservit's books on the deliberate dumbing down of America. The point that I am making is that you can absorb your cultural behavior from the people who care about you in your community and in your family, or you can absorb it from on high. And the ruling powers want you to absorb it from on high because that is how they will control you. I am very sorry to say that I have to make some comments about current historical events. The documentary I want to show to you, and which I will start in a few moments, is intended to outline how you have been shaped and how I have been shaped by the forces on high so that you will be an acceptable member of this managed society. Two things have happened very recently, and the Saker has written a rant on those two things that have happened. The two things that have happened recently is that Rex Tillerson has been removed from the Secretary of State position, and replaced with, is it Max Pompeo?
Mike.
Pardon?
Mike.
I thought it was
Mike Pompeo, I think you're correct. The only good thing I can say about Rex Tillerson is that he was respected by the Russian leadership. They had dealt with him in the past, and almost certainly one of the first questions they asked him at their first official meeting was, who in the world is making decisions in the Trump administration? And when they talked with Mr. Tillerson, they may not have liked what he was saying, but they were in a position to trust what the man was saying, and this was still keeping open a stream of communication between those speaking for the United States and those speaking for Russia. And Tillerson did not want a conflict with Russia, and initially neither did Donald Trump. With Trump's total surrender to the Zionist forces, that probably has changed, because Mike Pompeo is a servant of the Zionists and is fully in agreement that Iran is a four-star enemy. So I fully expect the United States to be at war with Iran inside the next 3 years.
Tillerson had a global view.
Tillerson had a global view, and Pompeo basically has bought into the Jared Kushner view of the Zionist view of the world. What is good for Zionism is good for the United States. The second element that I want to share with you is this so-called poison attack on a double agent of Russia in Great Britain. In the United States, political assassinations are carried out with automobile accidents, with fake suicides, induced heart attacks, any of a relatively common form of death that is otherwise accidental but can be induced by certain agents, whether we're talking about a computer in an automobile, whether we're talking about a dart that induces a heart attack, or whether we can be talking about somebody who puts a rope around your neck and causes you to commit suicide. This is the way American political assassinations are carried out with some frequency. David Kelly was suicidal.
Mail bombs.
Mail bomb. In Great Britain, there is a succession of people who have died under amazingly suspicious circumstances with basically autographed signatures from Russia instead of these anonymous murders in the United States. Whether you have Litvinenko dying from polonium, whether you have this Skriba dying from, what is it, whatever the poison gas is called, all of these deaths or attacks are conducted in this fashion that basically writes, Kilroy was here on the back of the victim. Now, either the Russians want to announce their perfidy to the West, or somebody wants to point a finger at the Russians and say, you are the enemy. Now, if you think the Russians are this stupid, I really want you to consider a bridge that I have to rent, because you can install a toll bridge there and make a lot of money. The long and short of this is, if we apply anything like logic to human behavior, what is going on in Great Britain now is simply a stampede to generate enthusiasm for hating Russia, despising Putin, and getting people inspired to protect, the responsibility to protect. Perhaps to get involved in Syria, with Pompeo in charge of state. There is now, by the way, an American air base in the middle of the Negev desert in Israel. So the first time a Hezbollah or Iranian rocket hits anywhere in Israel, guess what? The United States will declare that it is at war with Iran or with Hezbollah.
How long is that air base, or how long has that flag been up?
About 6 months, very recently. Larry Wilkerson, who has maintained the vast majority of his integrity even after getting out of the government, says that this is an intentional tripwire. Like the air bases, American air bases in occupied Syria, in the eastern part of Syria, one of the reasons for establishing an official air base there is so that when it is attacked, the American governments can say Americans have been attacked, whether by the Assad government or by Hezbollah or by the Iranian government. So like 1917, the American people are being set up to be stampeded into a war that the American people don't want, but that the Zionists do want. Now, having said that about current events, I want you to be aware that when you're watching television, when you are listening to the radio, when you are reading your newspapers, unless they are very carefully selected, you are being fed the same way that chickens are fed antibiotic-containing feed in order to prevent you from being exposed to valid information. With that as an introduction, I want to show you one part of a documentary as to how you are brainwashed from kindergarten on. I'm going to introduce, first I want you to see this demonstration of politicians applauding before AIPAC, because I think it is very descriptive of what AIPAC actually does to the American people. And then one more just for the fun of it. This one I would like to post in the library, but I seriously doubt that they're going to let me do so. I want you to die for Israel in Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. Yeah, Syria and Lebanon are next. Oh, and it might also, because of the hysteria concerning Russia, it is almost certain that the Ukrainians are going to attack the Donbass so that Russia would be confronted with conflict on two different fronts. And now that comment reminds me that I want to share with you the Saker's rant about the behavior of the Americans and the British. All of you have noticed that Americans and Westerners in general have been behaving progressively irrational since at least 9/11. And Saker says the four following characteristics are key features of the way the West is behaving. We have been hysterical. Our governments have been incredibly hypocritical. We have willed to be ignorant. And I think that is important. Whenever Putin says A, it is a reflex that the Western media says A must be a lie, and we will say that non-A is the reality, because if Putin believes it, it's got to be a lie. Very interestingly, as Putin, as the Saker goes on, he discusses how disconnected the Western individual is from the ability to think analytically and carefully. And his comment is that Westerners have come to think that the appearance of something is more important than the reality. It goes back almost to Jesus' parable that the Pharisees are like whited sepulchres that are beautifully whitewashed on the outside and are filled with rotting corpses on the inside. But the beautiful whitewashed building is more important than the rot that is inside. What is striking to me when I read that essay, and that essay is available to you at uns.com, and it's available at thesaker.is. The very same statement that the appearance of doing right is more important than the doing of good was made by a member of the Treasury Department to a lawyer who was looking at Goldman Sachs' way of keeping records. And the member of the Treasury was expecting to work for Goldman Sachs when he got out of working for the Treasury, and he wanted to create the best possible working situation for Goldman Sachs. He tried to manipulate and manage the report that this investigator was creating. And he said out loud that appearances were more important than the reality. The absurdity of that comment is, to my mind, kind of mind-boggling. It really reminds me of a marvelously physically attractive female member of parliament, member of the Knesset of Israel. She's really physically, to my mind as a male, quite attractive until she opens her goddamn mouth. I apologize for my French, because what she has to say is so hateful vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis the rest of the human race, that the contrast is just mind-boggling. I might say the same thing about Miss Haley, but...
So are you saying that you're a victim of your training, that appearances are more important than the content?
I'm saying that Americans appear to believe that appearances are more important than the reality. Yes. They listen to Nikki Haley or this member of Knesset, and they might be allowing these people's appearances to shape their interpretation of what they are saying. What does it matter?
But that goes for male political officials also. Like,
Oh, of course,
yeah,
of course. It applies to movie stars who endorse a political platform. At one point in time, I had considerable respect for Morgan Freeman. Very recently, that respect bounced off the floor when he said we are at war with Russia. In my opinion, that was absolutely contemptible. So much for my impression. I commend to you that comment by the Saker. Its title in uns.com is "When Dealing with a Bear, Hubris is Suicidal." Hubris is arrogance. It's available in 2 separate spots. Now, let me terminate my rant with you on that score and show you this, just the first part of this documentary.
If you don't submit to control, if you're a radical, you're less likely to be loved. You're not fitting in with society. You're viewed as an outsider. So there's a lot of social prohibitions about the outsider and the person who's going to upset things.
From the time we're very young, we're taught to, worship authority basically because that's our key to survival as young children. But as adults, we never go through the rites of passage that tell us how to methodically think for ourselves, and thus we're always in a state of extended adolescence.
Well, we take all this stuff, whether it's the television or it's the enculturation, the schoolyards, the teachers, we take this whole system, we put it into our unconscious mind. And it is the GIGO that comes out, garbage in, garbage out. We simply, in that computer language, have harnessed our own power by accepting all these beliefs as though they are factual, whether it's the flat earth of Columbus, or it's the idea that I'm not good enough to be or to do something I've dreamed to do.
To the degree that the individual loses a sense of what freedom really means for himself, mind control is working. This is the constant battle and the struggle. What does my freedom mean to me? What is it? How deep does it go? How far-reaching is it?
Individuals come already with their rights. They're born with their rights. They're inherent. They're hardwired. They're hardware.
It's tragic. They've lost their sense of the importance of the individual, each individual. We're not animals. We're individuals. We're created in the image of God.
And so what you have is everybody's born into this control structure. Everybody's born into authority. Everyone's born into this situation. But just because you have an authority making decisions for you at some point when you're very young, too young to take care of yourself, doesn't mean you should always cater to authority your whole life.
Fatalism, defeatism, what Bob Marley called mental slavery. That's a huge thing that he would sing about. How do we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? Have we moved to that point of such slavery that we're too far gone?
And just kind of letting it all flow by and being apathetic about it just gets you in a position of being controlled.
There are some people that don't care. There are some people that don't know and don't want to know. It is very frightening. If you really look at it, you would be left with the understanding that you were obligated to do something about it. And, people work really hard every day and they just want to relax and enjoy their life.
We have established a framework for the most part, works pretty good. People enter into this contract with society. That contract allows them to follow certain rules and expect certain returns on their investment of working within the framework of the contract.
Human beings form habits. At some point in our lives, many of us realize that the lives we are living are not those which we have imagined, but rather lives reflecting others' imaginations, as if we have been unwitting actors in someone else's script. Are we acting out the artificial roles created by others who have successfully harnessed our minds through our habits? To answer that question, one must first learn how the minds of individuals can be harnessed by systems of psychological control. Are the habits reflected by human beings in direct conflict with their needs to survive and thrive in this world? The enormous implications deter many of us from asking these simple questions and finding answers relevant to our daily lives.
If we don't resist all of the different information that comes our way and weigh it and use our own mind instead of what somebody else wants us to think, eventually society would become nothing more than automatons, robots.
The establishment it's protected itself unless you submit to the saturation indoctrination and adopt all its values. You can't get in.
Everyone needs to find out and really think about it. What is going too far? Because all of this is happening so fast, You need to be ahead of the game. They're ahead of the game.
Humans subjugate themselves to control because they're born into it. And the tyrants and the social engineers know how to incrementally begin to slowly ratchet up the manipulation, the domination, the oppression, so that people never really recognize it coming. It's the old analogy of the frog in the boiling pot. You throw a frog into a boiling pot, folks in Louisiana will tell you this, a bullfrog, he'll jump out. But if you put him in a cold pot, turn it on simmer, heat it up slow, he'll boil, and he'll never see it coming.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with group collectivism, and like, go back to John Dewey, you know, he hated the individual. He hated the rugged individualism of Americans. They had to get rid of that. And Carnegie very deeply involved in that. They even talk about getting rid of that, huh? And so I think that when you've been reduced to a member of the group, the collective, whether it's through sensitivity training that teachers have to go through, or whether, you know, it's in your own community, like we have a community-oriented policing system, you know, where they give you a medal. If you do a good deed, well, you know, you're part of the collective with the police.
I would say in the next 50 years, if large numbers of people don't become consciously resistant to the overall mind control exerted on society, we're going to see many more people who really truly resemble androids. People induce this themselves by looking out at the world and saying, it's too dangerous for me to tell the truth or to say what I really believe or express how I really feel. It's much better if I fabricate a completely synthetic personality that's going to sit back here and remain passive. That's how it works.
The idea of short-term gain, basically giving up freedoms. Giving up freedoms is never a good idea.
Since the dawn of time, small groups of human beings have instilled artificial circular limitations on the minds of their subjects through the procession of history. Traditionally, the limitations are imprinted on the servile population through a cunning use of language, instruction, and media for the purposes of conquest, social cohesion, and authoritative order by harnessing the human resources of the broad population. Human history reflects countless stories, regardless of what era you happen to live in, and the common thread throughout these stories is that of the struggle between the state, whatever its form, and the individual, the goal of which is to harness and subsume the individual, willingly or unwillingly, into its group collective.
The role of authority is a predatory system that sees the individual basically as a unit of energy. The first forms of mind control go back to prehistory. And you would simply have a priest class that developed technologies of herbs and medicine and had a value to the tribe. But pretty soon the priest class would start studying the sky and when there were solar and lunar eclipses, and would say, hey, the sun's not going to come back on this date unless you make me king or unless you give me total control. And the people would say, okay, we saw the eclipse when you said it was coming. You know, the snake god ate the sun to the moon. What do you want? I want your firstborn child. Sacrifice him to me. Every culture does that. Every culture at one time or another demands human sacrifice because that's the state or the priest class demanding absolute, total fealty and submission to it.
Mind control has existed since the dawn of time. Only the methods have changed. Elites have always known, if I can control the minds of my people, I control them. Only the technology has changed. It's still the same program. It's never stopped.
Sun Tzu, within the works of The Art of War, talk about the fact that if you can understand your enemy so well to the level of where you can psych him out, basically defeat him before you put one boot on the battlefield, you've become a true master of your domain.
The Greek author Plato embedded several key characteristics of ruling groups in his monumental work known as The Republic. Therein, he introduces the term cybernetics as a description of steering the ship of state, emphasizing crowd control. Plato memorialized the essence of the scenario used to control individuals to this day, to make them part of the group or state. This is famously known as the allegory of the cave, a useful strategy which is emblematic of the history of mind control.
The idea of cybernetics first shows up in Plato's Republic, I believe it's book 6, and in the Greek original text it's read kybernetes. But you can easily discern how this word tied into cybernetics, the control of not only nations, but how the making of individuals into the collective that forms the nations came about.
As we've moved through history, every great leader has had to understand the potential of information, the potential of speech, the potential of words, the potential of books.
What is a citizen, if not someone willingly or unwillingly participating in the machinations of the state? How would we acquire the habits of citizenship without stimulus from the state and our response to it?
Attention! Attention! This is your beloved leader, Og the Exalted. There will be a special Science Joy rally today at Og Memorial Stadium.
In an attempt to assist the state, a 14th century Italian named Niccolo Machiavelli crafted several books intended to help the ruling elite dominate their subjects with the most effective psychological warfare techniques available to the world at that time.
And he was trying to convert the Medici family into hiring him to provide political advice. Conspiracy is the story of history. It's the story of plunderers taking care of people who produce. They claim to take care of them through government, which doesn't give you anything, it doesn't take away first. So it's not creating something out of nothing. It's very real what they're doing. They're taking your rights or taking some people's rights and adding more to someone else's rights.
Concurrent to Machiavelli's efforts, the consequences of tyranny were sowing the seeds of liberty throughout Europe, with authors like Etienne de la Boétie of France leading individuals to consider their situations and discover effective means to achieving liberty for all.
So this whole idea of Machiavelli telling the ruling elite how to do this in a more efficient and effective manner without people directly knowing about it. But his mistake is that these books get out there and other people start to read these books because it's not just the ruling elite. This starts to have an influence in Europe. You've got a character named Etienne de la Boétie who writes a discourse on voluntary servitude. And basically what de la Boétie does is he shows you that everything that Machiavelli told the ruling elite about how to control you is undone when you understand it to the nuts and bolts level, where you can then withdraw your consent, and that only then are you free.
We control you. We control your mind. We make you believe you have no creative power. We make you forget you have imagination, which is the core capability from which you can invent your own reality.
The myriad components of collectivism combine to form a comprehensive system for transforming the individual into a cog within the machinery of the state. The first step is to remove self-reliance, thus creating dependence on the state or collective. The next step is to create a motivation based on fear of scarcity, as opposed to creativity and productivity. Remove the systems of autonomy, creativity, and self-teaching, which help create individuality in the first place, and the void is filled by the will of the collective. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the mind is no different. Innovative and enigmatic German philosopher of the 19th century, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, observed that human history could be manipulated to create a contrived outcome. Hegel's essential observations of the methods by which history may be authored by a small group translate into a world in which an individual's choices may be engineered away from his needs.
How to engineer the opinion of the American people so that they would fully endorse, not only endorse, but demand a war.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit. It hit another building, flew right into the middle of it. Explosion.
So it's problem, the people then beg for it, that's reaction, and then it's solution, which is centralizing more control.
Create the problem, people scream, you can impose any solution you want on people.
One recent practical example of the use of Hegel's method for control is that of the infamous underwear bomber.
I'm Kurt Haskell. I'm a Michigan attorney and more well known as being the main eyewitness to the underwear bomber event on Christmas Day 2009. I saw two men approach the desk. One looked like a poor African man, or maybe late teenager, and one looked like a wealthier Indian-looking man who had on a tan suit. They were walking together, and I just thought they were a weird pair, and I was wondering why the two were together, and I listened to their conversation as they went up to the desk and talked to the airline worker. When they went up there, just the Indian man spoke, and he said, this man needs to get on the flight, but he doesn't have a passport. And then the airline worker said, well, he can't get on the flight without a passport. And then the Indian man kind of argued with her, saying, well, he's from Sudan, and we do this all the time.
The student from Nigeria smuggled explosives onto a flight in his underwear. Prosecutors staged a demonstration of what might have happened, but something went wrong. Abdul Muttalab's trousers burst into flames. Passengers and crew grabbed him. The plane landed safely.
A source has confirmed that Farouk Muttalab is the son of Alhaji Muttalab, former chairman of one of Nigeria's biggest, wealthiest and most respected banks, First Bank of Nigeria.
As soon as this happens, we see Mr. Chertoff all over the news and TV everywhere promoting these body scanning machines.
But there are a few things we could do to make things better. First, we could deploy the scanning machines that we currently are beginning to deploy in the U.S. that would give us the ability to see what someone has concealed underneath their clothing.
To meet agendas in conflict with the needs of individuals, the ruling class creates an artificial crisis to which the public reacts by begging for the ruling class to intervene. The ruling class then enjoys the plunder made possible by removing the self-reliance from individuals.
Good morning, everybody. Today's hearing is the third in a series of subcommittee hearings focused on some of the causes and consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, a man-made economic assault on our country that is still foreclosing on homes, shuttering businesses, and driving unemployment.
The combined philosophies of Thomas Malthus, Charles Darwin, and Herbert Spencer led to the development of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism grafted the concept of the survival of the fittest onto the larger social framework. Claims of biological advantages or superiority could then be advanced as justification for future economic policy relating to the poor, and as the basis of Francis Galton's pseudoscience of eugenics in the 20th century.
So Darwin comes along about 150 years ago and comes out with his theories on where life comes from, and then it's survival of the fittest, and that the best organisms are able to survive in a competitive environment and move forward in the evolutionary chain. And whether that theory is correct or partially correct or totally wrong is a side issue. The robber barons, the British royalty, the J.P. Morgans of the world publicly adopted the idea of Darwinism and merged it with predatory eugenics.
And the eugenicists, who have always been looking for scientific causes to justify their sinning, if you will, that's what they found so useful in Darwin's work, is they said, we've already had this belief system that we're better than you, but we now have science to back it up.
Our entire current civilization, what we know as globalism, the New World Order, is based on eugenics scientists that developed their theories in the last 200 years, mainly in England, Germany, and the United States. The entire science of genetics, biometrics, eugenics, computers, all of it came out of the search for a system of total control over humanity.
So the issue with eugenics is it claims to be a science of self-adaptation for human species. So it sounds like a great thing if you're an individual. You want to make yourself better. If you reproduce, you want your kids to be strong and survive. However, the people who are doing it are taking and making a bunch of decisions for other people and violating volition and their free will all over the place because that's their modus operandi.
In his 1928 book, The Open Conspiracy, former British psychological warfare expert H.G. Wells wrote, "The political world of the open conspiracy must weaken, efface, incorporate, and supersede existing governments. The character of the open conspiracy will then be plainly displayed. It will be a world religion. This large, loose, assimilatory mass of groups and societies will definitely and obviously attempt to swallow up the entire population of the world and become a new human community. The immediate task before all people, a planned world state, is appearing as 1,000 points of light, but generations of propaganda and education may have to precede it."
The government of England put massive funding towards the study of humans, and not just medicine, but human behavior. And so all the sciences that the British Empire used on countries that it was attacking and regions it was conquering were also turned inward against their own populations.
In 1948, Eric Blair, the British journalist and author who assumed the nom de plume of George Orwell, wrote the iconic dystopian novel 1984. In it, Orwell outlined a collectivist future governed by technocrats, in which a Big Brother totalitarian state maintains control of society through constant panopticon-inspired surveillance, fueled by a perpetual war and emboldened by both covert and overt forms of mind control and mass persuasion.
The premise of the panopticon, it was an architectural design that was set up to maximize the power of surveillance. So if the prisoners didn't know, they could never tell if they were actually being watched at any one time, so they would have to assume that they were always being watched.
Through 1984, Orwell introduced the concept of newspeak into popular culture, a debased language structure that would suppress the ability of the masses to upset the power of the state by regulating their thoughts through an illusory police force known as the thought police. Orwell's notion of doublespeak demonstrated the cognitive dissonance inherent in tyrannical structures. As the meanings of the words change, the meaning in society is lost.
And fortunately, we have been able to raise our standard of living without sacrificing the spiritual side of life, which means so much to the American family.
Thomas Henry Huxley, the man known as Darwin's bulldog, produced a number of grandchildren, the two best known and most influential being Julian and Aldous Huxley. Sir Julian Huxley, an evolutionary biologist, was elected as the first Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and also served as both Vice President and President of the British Eugenics Society.
So the Huxley family is highly interesting because T.H. Huxley is the teacher over H.G. Wells who becomes a famous protege. But Huxley's whole family is not only intermarried and working on these eugenics ideas themselves, but they have, he has a famous son and grandson and all sorts of famous cousins that tie into the Darwin-Wedgwood family. So notably, you have Aldous Huxley, who coins the phrase Brave New World in 1932 with his novel, which is really describing a technocratic future by which people are pharmaceutically drugged into loving their servitude.
I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, as I foresaw in Brave New World, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
Leveraging the fact that the 20th century opened up numerous avenues for shaping and controlling the thoughts and behaviors of the population, the ruling elite contrived new ways of obscuring useful facts while peddling useless ideas to the American people. Advertising, in addition to fundamental changes in education, produced a population of non-thinkers whose false understanding of basic concepts instilled through public schooling led to generations of people who feel they are magically endowed with the ability to somehow attain knowledge without first observing the landscape of available, credible evidence. One such artifact of credible evidence which demonstrates that our lives are being scripted by the ruling class is a 1966 textbook authored by Georgetown professor Dr. Carroll Quigley, titled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. In it, Quigley details a secret society, partially funded by central banker Lord Rothschild, enacted by Cecil Rhodes and led by Lord Alfred Milner, and the Round Table Journal of International Affairs, which Quigley terms the Milner Group. The first questions most people ask upon hearing of such a book are, why is it so important? And why do so few know about its existence?
This is a key book. It's almost like the Rosetta Stone to decode everything they're doing. It's over 1,000 pages long with incredible, documentation in the bibliography of how this ruling elite based out of Britain is using a full spectrum dominance model to fund the communists, to fund the fascists, to fund the Democrats, to fund the Republicans, so that there looks like there's a choice, but everything really is moving towards collectivism for the general public, while the elite themselves are exempt from all their own rules.
These are the ideas of people who plunder that care not about laws or boundaries or nations or your rights. They see might makes right. And so when Cecil Rhodes goes in and creates Rhodesia, and you have South Africa and the De Beers whole cartel of diamonds and gold, and then you look at who Cecil Rhodes left his will to, who funded him to go down there and do that, you keep coming back to the historical central bankers that have been manipulating world events as we've been taught them for at least since the beginning of our country. 1776, 1790 is when they start to gain a foothold. They then come over in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, pre-Civil War, gain a stronger foothold. And by the end of the Civil War, we're completely switched over to a system that we had fought 60 years before to overthrow.
Once the power structure got all the best and brightest students of the world and put them through Rhodes Scholar type programs, not just in England, but in other nations, they could then control the brain trust and have a fully programmed new generation to take control of the governmental, corporate, and media systems to carry out the program.
Their goal was to dominate all of those major power centers quietly behind the scenes. And by moving the leadership in a certain direction, then they knew that they could control the masses without the masses even knowing that they're being dominated and led by a very small, powerful elite group.
In further pursuit of the science of controlling human resources, the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes spawned the Pilgrim Society in both America and England, which created a global brain trust. Its goal? To assert global control by dividing its tasks into working groups, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group, and Trilateral Commission throughout the 20th century. In more recent history, the long-held beliefs of the ruling class regarding control of the individual's body by the undermining of his mental abilities were then furthered by the technological breakthroughs of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 19th century, the Prussian government conducted research into the study of how to make individuals compliant cogs in the machine of their conflict-based empire. Prussian psychologist Wilhelm Wundt determined that the individual human being has no soul, and can thus be programmed like an automaton or robot.
You see, the social engineers don't need us under social Darwinism. We're scum to be removed. We are seen as nothing but biological androids or replicants from the Philip K. Dick book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, turned into Blade Runner. We're just seen as dumbed down biological workers.
When individual identity has been forsaken, it is much easier to compartmentalize the minds of those being controlled. Various personages throughout history have described the human being as a machine, but it was the synergy amongst the work of Wilhelm Wundt, Ivan Pavlov, and many others, which scientifically quantified the individual as soulless, thus justifying manipulation to plunder individuals of their rights, transforming individuals into human resources.
Our system is copied from a 1819 Prussian system that's a three-tiered education system. One tier is for the intellectual elite. The second tier is for the servers of the intellectual elite. They would be the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers. And the last tier is for the lay. It's for the masses.
Education, as we know it, is nothing more than mind control. It is the science of control. And the British scientists, the eugenicists, came up with systems to dumb people down and make them submissive. But the German model, in fact, namely the Prussian model, that was designed to create soldiers that were owned by the state, but that were so brainwashed they were proud to go off and march into musket fire. That system, known as kindergarten, is the whole basis of modern Western education.
I'm going to stop up there for economy, and I will send each of you the web address for getting the whole documentary. And what is key for the documentary is to help you be aware of the programming to which you and every American, for example, has been subjected. One of the amazing things about the Amish community is that the Amish were willing to go to prison en masse in order to resist schooling, collective schooling, as it was organized at that time. They only avoided that by making rational compromises with the federal government, that the teachers, that they instituted certain rules according to which they were willing to let their children go to state-managed schools. One of which was that the teachers needed to understand and respect the Amish way of life. Number two, they were not allowed to bus their children long distances, any distances, so that you're talking about local schools. Basically, the Amish were willing to go to prison for the sake of maintaining the family unit, in contrast to the federally mandated school unit in terms of socialization. I think we're going to call it quits for now on that score. Any questions or comments?
This is, go ahead. I was going to say, you know, so you're talking about Huxley, Orwell, Wells, even Quigley. Aren't they, when they wrote those books, I always got the feeling that they were exposing what the intent of the ruling class is. But in this, it almost makes it out to be that they're in cahoots, or they're promoting the idea. So what I think
it depends on which author you are talking about, Janet. I'll use Carroll Quigley because he's the most controversial in that respect. Quigley initially approved of the methods and the goal of the secret society. The more he became aware of its implications, the more appalled he became. He gave an interview toward the end of his life where he told the interviewer, we're going to have to edit this out because you have to be careful about my future as well as your own. So at the end of Quigley's life, he recognized that he was walking on very, very dangerous grounds. That was not the situation when he was writing Tragedy and Hope. Huxley is a good example on the same order. Huxley was in complete agreement with the program of creating automaton-type human beings. On the other hand, Bertrand Russell, who was not mentioned in the film, but was also initially an advocate of a managed society. As he saw it being put into practice in several sub-societies, he became horrified, and at the end of his life he said, "This is not what I meant by a managed society." Those who looked at the managed society from the point of view of an ethicist, and I'm not talking about a particular kind of ethicist, be it Muslim or Christian or Buddhist, I'm talking about from a point of view of an ethical survival of a culture, they became progressively horrified at the implications of collectivism. They saw it as efficient, but what was sacrificed in the name of efficiency was everything that we consider to be human. When John Rappaport says that if people don't change their habits, they will progressively become automatons, not only is he correct, but it is being fulfilled in our time. As one example, inflatable sex dolls are being sold and utilized as authentic alternatives for human sexuality in our time. 50 years ago, that would have been absurd. 100 years ago, it would have been considered obscene. Now it is seen as the cutting edge of some kind of social development. That's just one example. I'm using it as one I happen to be aware of because of the other studies that I've been doing. Unlike the resistance against the ruling elite, resistance of this kind of collectivism can be done on an individual basis, fortunately. I'm interested in people developing their own sense of personality and their own sense of individualism. I'm flirting with the idea of taking up the saxophone at my age. I'll never get good at it, but it'll still be fun, A, to learn about music, and B, to be creating of it. The development of human creativity, whether you're talking about music or art or poetry, is a direct defiance of collectivism. And I encourage people to do that. In addition, however, I think we need to fill the streets and, as one documentary said, be the friction that stops the machine. Demita, you had something to add?
No, I was just impressed by how, up until recently, there was one of the things that made white people white, here we go, and black people black, is that there was this more of a tendency to look at, part of that dehumanization came from looking at us not as individuals, but as, more as like a mass,
It's also, it's a form of mental laziness. If I can put you in a cubby hole, whether the cubby hole is female, whether the cubby hole is black, whether the cubby hole is heterosexual.
Right. The point is, though, that was one of the distinguishing factors in racialization of American population, is that the individual expression was something reserved for white people. And you could be an individual where those lumped masses couldn't. So that's one thing. And so I don't know.
I would submit, however, that the whole process of individuation is progressively reserved for the ruling elite. Now, remember the stratification in the Prussian model. 1/2 of 1% are human beings. This is very parallel, by the way, with at least the Talmudic understanding of humanity. The Talmudic, well, let's stick with the Prussian model first. 1/2 of 1% are capable and are trained to become fully human. And even that 0.5% are trained to serve the rest of society as their creative, thinking, integrating leaders. The next 5% who are granted certain privileges, because being in the 5% is a whole lot better than being in the 95%, they are still trained to serve the collective. And the remaining 95% are trained to serve the collective as anonymous cogs. But they are all trained to serve the collective.
You started to say Talmudic viewpoint.
Oh, the Talmudic viewpoint is that the real human beings are the Bnei Israel, the Jews, and Goyim are, the souls of Goyim are a little different than those of four-legged beasts, but not nearly as elevated as the souls of the Bnei Israel.
Yeah.
Do all Jews believe that? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Do certain Jews believe it, and does it color and shape their understanding of politics? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the sound system. I'm going to bring speakers next week.